Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where the light of reason has been extinguished and the flames of war burn eternal across a million worlds, there exists a power more terrifying than any blade, more devastating than any cannon, and more insidious than any plague. It is the power of the mind unshackled, the ability to reach beyond the thin membrane that separates the material universe from the roiling chaos of the warp. This power, this gift, this curse, has shaped the destiny of humanity more profoundly than any military conquest or technological marvel. And of all the beings who have ever wielded this terrible power, none have done so with such devastating mastery, such brilliant insight, and such tragic consequence as the one they call the Crimson King. His name is Magnus the Red, and his story is one of the greatest tragedies ever written in the annals of human history. It is a story that spans 10,000 years and more, a narrative that touches upon every corner of a galaxy, torn asunder by civil war and demonic invasion. It is a tale of genius brought low by pride, of love corrupted into hatred, of salvation twisted into damnation. And it begins, as all the greatest stories do, with a father who dreamed of creating something perfect, and a son who was born to disappoint him. To understand Magnus, you must first understand the universe into which he was born. In the early years of the 31st millennium, humanity stood on the brink of a golden age, unlike anything it had ever known. The emperor of mankind, that immortal psychic god-king who had guided humanity's development for tens of thousands of years. It had finally completed the unification of Terra and launched the Great Crusade to reunite humanity's scattered colonies. His armies of genetically enhanced super soldiers, the Space Marines, swept across the galaxy like a tide of ceramite and bolter fire, bringing world after world back into the fold of the newborn Imperium. It was an age of conquest and expansion, of discovery and wonder, of hope for a future in which humanity would finally claim its rightful place as the dominant species in the galaxy. But there was a shadow over this golden age, a threat that the Emperor knew would eventually destroy everything he had built if it was not addressed. That threat was the warp, the parallel dimension of pure psychic energy that existed alongside the material universe. The warp was not merely a source of danger, but also a necessity. For it was only through the warp that faster-than-light travel was possible, only through the warp that communication could span the vast distances between stars. Humanity had become dependent on a realm that was fundamentally hostile to its existence, a dimension populated by malevolent intelligences that hungered for nothing less than the complete annihilation of all sentient life. He was born to be humanity's greatest champion against the darkness, engineered by the Emperor himself to be a beacon of psychic illumination that would guide mankind through the treacherous waters of the warp. Instead, he became the unwitting architect of the Imperium's greatest catastrophe, the destroyer of his father's most precious work, and the eternal servant of the very forces he once sought to master. But to understand Magnus is to understand the terrible price of ambition unchecked by wisdom, the devastating consequences of good intentions perverted by pride, and the cruel irony that sometimes the road to damnation is paved with the most noble of aspirations. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a being of such immense psychic power that his mere presence causes reality to shudder and buckle. Imagine a mind so vast and so ancient that it contains libraries worth of forbidden knowledge, secrets that could remake worlds or destroy them utterly. Imagine eyes that can pierce the veil between dimensions, that can see the swirling currents of fate and possibility that flow through the immaterium like rivers of light and shadow. This is Magnus the Red, the demon primarch of Tzeentch. And his tale begins not in the depths of the warp or upon the demon worlds of the Eye of Terror, but in the Emperor's own laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient Terra. The creation of the Primarchs was the Emperor's greatest and most secret work, a project of such staggering ambition that it defied comprehension even by the standards of that age of wonders. Using techniques both scientific and arcane, the master of mankind crafted 20 demigods, each designed to embody a different aspect of human potential, each meant to serve as a general and exemplar for the great crusade that would reunite humanity's scattered colonies under a single banner. But among all his sons, Magnus was unique, for he alone was designed not just as a warrior or a leader, but as a living conduit for psychic power itself. The Emperor knew that humanity's relationship with the warp was changing, evolving in ways that could not be stopped or controlled. The Age of Strife had proven that unchecked psychic power could tear civilizations apart, could open doorways to the nightmarish dimension where malevolent intelligences waited to devour souls. But the Emperor also knew that the warp could not simply be abandoned or ignored. Humanity needed psychers, needed their abilities for communication across the vast distances of space, for navigation through the treacherous currents of the Imperium, and for defense against the entities that lurked within those ethereal depths. Magnus was to be the solution to this dilemma, a being who could master the warp rather than be mastered by it, who could teach humanity to harness psychic power safely and wisely. Yet from the very moment of his conception, Magnus was different from his brothers. While the other primarchs developed in their gestation capsules in a state of suspended awareness, Magnus was fully conscious, his vast intellect already reaching out to explore the limits of his confinement. He could sense the presence of his father, that blazing beacon of psychic power that illuminated the Emperor's laboratories like a second sun. And remarkably, impossibly, he could communicate with the Emperor even from within his capsule, sharing thoughts and impressions across the gulf that separated them. This early communion would shape Magnus's entire existence, forging a bond between father and son that was deeper and more intimate than anything the other primarchs would ever experience. It was also the beginning of Magnus's downfall. For in those early conversations, the seeds of his greatest tragedy were already being planted. The Chaos Gods, those ancient and malevolent intelligences that dwell within the warp, watched this communion with keen interest and mounting alarm. They understood what the Emperor was attempting to create, and they recognized the threat that Magnus represented to their eternal dominion over the Imperium. Working together in one of their rare moments of cooperation, the four dark gods struck at the Primarch project, scattering the gestation capsules across the galaxy through a massive warp storm. Each Primarch was flung to a different world, separated from their father and from each other, left to grow and develop far from the Emperor's guiding hand. Magnus's capsule came to rest upon a world called Prospero, and it is difficult to imagine a more perfect landing site for the young demigod. Prospero was a planet that had been settled centuries earlier by refugees fleeing persecution, a world that had become a haven for those who possessed the mutant gift of psychic power. In the dark times following the Age of Strife, psychers had been hunted and killed throughout the galaxy, blamed for the catastrophes that had torn humanity apart. But on Prospero, they had found sanctuary, building a civilization dedicated to the study and mastery of the very powers that others feared and hated. The people of Prospero discovered the young Magnus shortly after his arrival, and they marveled at the copper-skinned infant who radiated psychic power like a miniature star. They took him in, raised him as one of their own, and taught him everything they knew about the arts of the mind. But it quickly became apparent that Magnus needed no teacher, for his natural abilities far exceeded anything the Prosperans had ever encountered. While other psychers spent years learning to control even the simplest mental projections, Magnus mastered entire disciplines in days. While the greatest sorcerers of Prospero could barely glimpse the surface of the great ocean, as they called the warp, Magnus could dive into its deepest currents, swimming through streams of pure possibility and emerging with knowledge that no mortal had ever possessed. Magnus grew to physical maturity with astonishing speed, his body developing to match the enormity of his mind. He was a giant among giants, standing head and shoulders above even the tallest of the Prosperan people. Yet his skin retained its distinctive copper hue, earning him the name by which he would be known throughout history, Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. But perhaps his most distinctive feature was his single cyclopean eye, a burning orb of amber that seemed to see not just the material world, but the psychic currents that flowed beneath and through it. Some whispered that Magnus had been born with two eyes, but had sacrificed one in some dark bargain with the powers of the warp. Others claimed that his singular vision was a mark of his unique connection to the Imperium. The truth would not be revealed for many years, and when it was, it would cast a terrible shadow over everything Magnus had ever done. Under Magnus's guidance, Prospero flourished as never before, while the young primarch united the scattered communities of psykers into a single civilization, building gleaming cities of white marble and gold that rivaled anything in the galaxy. The greatest of these was Tizca, the City of Light, a metropolis dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. At the heart of Tizca rose the great pyramid temples of the Prosperan cults, each one devoted to a different aspect of psychic study, each one containing libraries that held the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Magnus himself dwelt in the highest of these pyramids, the Pyramid of Photep, spending long hours in meditation and study, plumbing the depths of mysteries that no other being could even comprehend. But Magnus was not content merely to learn. He was driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge, and a compulsion to understand every secret of the universe, no matter how dangerous or forbidden. He explored the depths of the warp with reckless abandon, venturing into regions that even the most powerful demonic entities feared to tread. He made contact with beings of immense power, entities that existed outside the normal boundaries of time and space, and he bargained with them for knowledge that no mortal was meant to possess. In his arrogance, Magnus believed that he could control these exchanges, that his vast intellect and psychic power made him immune to the dangers that had destroyed lesser minds. He was wrong. One of the entities Magnus encountered in his explorations was of particular significance, though he did not recognize it as such at the time. This being presented itself as a helpful spirit and a font of knowledge that was willing to share its secrets in exchange for nothing more than Magnus's attention and respect. It offered to teach him things that even the Emperor did not know, to show him pathways through the warp that led to power beyond imagining. Magnus, ever hungry for forbidden knowledge, accepted the entity's guidance without question. He did not realize that he was communing with Tzinch, the chaos god of change and sorcery, the architect of fate who had been watching him since before his birth. The bargains Magnus made in those early years would echo through the millennia, shaping his destiny in ways he could never have imagined. Meanwhile, the Emperor had completed his unification of Terra and launched the Great Crusade, the galaxy-spanning military campaign that would bring all of humanity's scattered worlds under the banner of the newborn Imperium. One by one, the Emperor's fleets discovered the lost primarchs, reuniting each with their father and placing them in command of the Space Marine legions that had been created from their genetic material. When the Emperor finally came to Prospero, he found not a primitive world waiting to be conquered, but a thriving civilization that welcomed him with open arms. The reunion of Magnus and the Emperor was a moment of profound significance for both father and son. For Magnus, it was the fulfillment of a dream he had cherished since infancy, the chance to finally stand before the being whose psychic presence had guided him through his earliest years. When the Emperor's fleet emerged from the warp above Prospero, as Magnus was waiting for them on the surface, standing alone on a vast marble plaza that had been prepared specifically for this moment. He had known they were coming for months, had watched their approach through the warp with his psychic sight, and had spent long hours preparing himself for the encounter that would define the rest of his existence. The Emperor descended from his flagship in a blaze of golden light, surrounded by his custodian guard, those superhuman warriors who served as his personal bodyguards. Even among the assembled grandeur, the master of mankind stood out like a sun among candles. He was taller than any mortal man, his features perfect in a way that transcended physical beauty, his presence so overwhelming that many who looked upon him fell to their knees in involuntary worship. But Magnus did not kneel, but he stood his ground, his single eye meeting his father's gaze without flinching, and for a long moment, the two most powerful psykers in the galaxy simply looked at each other. What passed between them, in that moment, has never been recorded. Some accounts suggest that they communicated telepathically, sharing a conversation that lasted hours in the span of a single breath. Others claim that no words were needed, that father and son understood each other completely through a connection that transcended ordinary language. What is known is that when the moment ended, both beings were smiling, and the Emperor placed his hand on Magnus's shoulder in a gesture of paternal affection that many of the other primarchs would never receive. The days that followed were the happiest of Magnus's life. The Emperor remained on Prospero for several weeks, exploring the libraries and archives that Magnus had assembled, discussing the nature of the warp and the potential of psychic power. For the first time, Magnus had found someone who could match his intellect, who could understand the subtleties of his research and appreciate the magnitude of his discoveries. The Emperor seemed genuinely impressed by what his son had accomplished, praising his scholarship and his mastery of the psychic arts. It was everything Magnus had ever dreamed of, everything he had spent his life working toward. But even in those golden days, there were troubling signs that Magnus chose to ignore. The Emperor was not merely impressed by his son's accomplishments. He was also concerned, deeply concerned, about the methods Magnus had used to achieve them. And he could sense the taint of chaos upon Magnus, the subtle corruption that had crept into his soul during his long years of exploration. He warned Magnus of the dangers of the warp, of the entities that lurked within its depths, waiting to ensnare the unwary. He spoke of the importance of discipline and restraint, of the need to approach psychic power with humility rather than arrogance. Magnus listened respectfully, but in his heart, he did not truly believe. He had walked the paths of the warp for decades without coming to harm. He had bargained with demons and emerged victorious. He had mastered powers that would have destroyed lesser minds, and he had done so through the strength of his own will and intellect. What could these dangers be to someone of his power and wisdom? Again, the Emperor's warning seemed like the concerns of an overprotective parent, well-intentioned but ultimately unnecessary. Magnus was not some apprentice sorcerer who needed to be cautioned about playing with forces beyond his control. He was the master of the warp, the greatest psyker his species had ever produced, and nothing could stand against him. This attitude, this fundamental disconnect between Magnus's perception of himself and the reality of his situation, would prove to be his greatest weakness. He was brilliant, yes, perhaps the most intelligent being ever to exist besides the Emperor himself, but he was also arrogant, convinced of his own infallibility in a way that blinded him to his own limitations. The Emperor saw this clearly, and it troubled him deeply. Yet he had designed Magnus to be humanity's greatest weapon against the dangers of the warp, but he was beginning to suspect that he had created something that might become an even greater danger instead. The Emperor gave Magnus command of the 15th Legion, the Space Marines who would come to be known as the Thousand Sons. This name was prophetic, though not in the way anyone intended, for it would eventually describe not the original strength of the Legion, but the terrible fate that awaited them. The Thousand Sons were unique among the Space Marine legions, for their gene seed, derived from Magnus's own genetic material, granted them an unusual propensity for psychic ability. While psychers existed in other legions, they were relatively rare, carefully controlled, and often viewed with suspicion. In the Thousand Sons, nearly every battle brother possessed some degree of psychic talent, and their entire culture was built around the study and refinement of these abilities. But this gift came with a terrible price. Almost from the beginning, the Thousand Sons were plagued by a genetic instability that their apothecaries called the flesh change. Without warning, battle brothers would begin to mutate, their bodies warping and twisting into horrific new forms as their genetic structure collapsed under the strain of their psychic abilities. Some transformed into mindless beasts, losing all traces of their former humanity. Others simply disintegrated, their flesh dissolving into pools of protoplasmic matter. The flesh change struck without pattern or warning, and no treatment or prevention could be found. The Thousand Sons faced extinction, and Magnus was powerless to save them. In his desperation, Magnus turned to the only source of help he could think of. He ventured once again into the depths of the warp, seeking out the entity that had guided him in his youth, the being he still believed to be a benevolent spirit of knowledge. He pleaded for a cure to the flesh change, offering anything in exchange for the salvation of his sons. And the entity answered, though its price was higher than Magnus could ever have imagined. It demanded his eye, that singular orb through which Magnus perceived the currents of the warp. Magnus agreed without hesitation, allowing the entity to pluck the organ from his skull in a ritual of unimaginable agony. In return, he received a cure of sorts, a psychic technique that could stabilize his son's genetic structure and halt the progression of the flesh change. Magnus returned to his legion in triumph, believing that he had saved them through his own wisdom and sacrifice. He did not realize that the entity he had bargained with was Tzeentch himself, and that the cure was not a gift but a trap. The flesh change had not been eliminated, only suppressed, bound by chains of sorcery that could be released at any time by the god of change. Magnus had not saved his legion. He had merely postponed their doom, while binding himself ever more tightly to the power that would eventually consume them all. This was the first of Magnus's great mistakes, and it would set the pattern for everything that followed. Again and again, the Crimson King would act with the best of intentions, seeking to protect those he loved and advance the cause of knowledge. And again, his actions would bring about the very disasters he sought to prevent. With the immediate crisis resolved, Magnus threw himself into the Great Crusade with all the passion and brilliance that had characterized his rule on Prospero. The Thousand Sons became renowned as one of the most effective legions in the entire expedition, not through brute force or military aggression, but through the sophisticated application of psychic abilities. Where other legions reduced worlds to rubble and ash, the Thousand Sons often achieved compliance through more subtle means, using their mental powers to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately persuade. They were scholars as much as warriors, and wherever they went, they sought out knowledge, preserving the libraries and archives of conquered worlds rather than burning them as many of their brothers did. Magnus himself became known as one of the most brilliant strategists in the entire Imperium, a commander who could peer into the future and anticipate enemy movements before they even began. His personal power on the battlefield was terrifying to behold. He could reduce entire fortifications to rubble with a gesture, tear the souls from enemy commanders without lifting a finger, and bend the very fabric of reality to his will. In single combat, he was nearly unmatched, his physical might augmented by sorcerous powers that made him virtually invincible. Only a handful of his brothers could hope to stand against him, and even they would have been hard-pressed to achieve victory. But Magnus's brilliance was matched by his arrogance, and his successes only fed his belief that he was beyond the dangers that lesser minds faced. He continued his explorations of the warp, delving ever deeper into forbidden regions and making contact with entities of ever greater power. He shared his discoveries with his sons, teaching them techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or acceptable. The Thousand Sons became sorcerers as much as warriors, their battle practices incorporating rituals and incantations that drew power directly from the Imperium. Magnus believed he was preparing his legion for a glorious future in which psychic power would be humanity's greatest asset. He did not see that he was leading them down a path of damnation. As the Great Crusade continued, as tensions began to rise between the Thousand Sons and their brother legions, many of the other primarchs viewed Magnus and his sorcerers with suspicion and distrust, seeing in their psychic abilities echoes of the witchcraft that had torn humanity apart during the Age of Strife. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was particularly outspoken in his opposition, considering Magnus's reliance on sorcery to be dishonorable and dangerous. Mortarion of the Death Guard harbored a deep personal hatred of psychers, born from the traumatic experiences of his youth on the nightmare world of Barbarous. Even some of the more moderate primarchs, like Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists and Korax of the Raven Guard, expressed concerns about the unchecked use of psychic power within the legions. Magnus dismissed these concerns with typical arrogance, at viewing his critics as ignorant barbarians who could not comprehend the subtleties of the craft he practiced. He believed that the truth of psychic power's benefits would eventually become apparent to everyone, that his successes would silence his detractors. In this, as in so many things, he was tragically wrong. The opposition to psykers continued to grow, fueled by incidents in which uncontrolled psychic abilities had led to disaster. Reports began to surface of entire worlds destroyed by psyker-induced catastrophes, of demonic incursions summoned by reckless sorcerers, of loyal citizens transformed into monsters by exposure to unshielded psychic energy. The voices calling for restrictions on psychic power grew louder and more insistent, until finally the Emperor himself was forced to address the issue. The Council of Nikaea was convened on a remote world at the edge of the galaxy, a vast gathering of the most powerful beings in the Imperium, brought together to decide the fate of psykers within the Space Marine legions. The world itself was geologically young, recently terraformed by the Mechanicum, at the Emperor's command specifically to host this momentous occasion. Its surface was dominated by a vast amphitheater carved from living rock, a structure so massive that it could seat tens of thousands of delegates with room to spare. The very air hummed with barely contained power as representatives from every major faction in the Imperium gathered to witness what many believed would be the most important debate in human history. Magnus arrived at the council confident of victory, while certain that his eloquence and wisdom would convince the assembled delegates of the benefits of psychic power. He had spent months preparing for this moment, assembling arguments and evidence that he believed would be irrefutable. He had brought with him examples of the wonders his legion had achieved through their mastery of the psychic arts, demonstrations of how controlled psychic power could benefit humanity in ways that nothing else could match. He had also brought dozens of librarians from across the legions, psyker space marines, who had used their abilities responsibly and effectively in service of the Emperor. These warriors would testify to the value of their gifts, proving that psychic power could be a tool of loyalty rather than corruption. But Magnus had gravely miscalculated the mood of the council, where what he saw as a debate about the future of the Imperium was, in truth, a trial, with himself and his legion as the accused. The forces arrayed against him were more numerous and more determined than he had anticipated, and they had come prepared to make their case with a passion that matched his own. Mortarion led the prosecution, the grim primarch of the Death Guard, whose own traumatic experiences with psychic-wielding tyrants had left him with an implacable hatred of all sorcery. He rose before the assembled delegates and delivered a speech that drew upon his personal history, describing in harrowing detail the horrors he had witnessed on his homeworld of Barbarous. He spoke of the overlords, those psychic monstrosities who had enslaved the human population and fed upon their suffering. Where he described the atrocities they had committed in the name of power, the way they had twisted and corrupted everything they touched. And he pointed directly at Magnus, his pale eyes burning with righteous fury, and declared that the Thousand Sons were walking the same path that had led to the nightmares of Barbarous. Lemon Russ supported Mortarion's arguments with characteristic bluntness. The Wolf King had never liked Magnus, viewing his reliance on sorcery as fundamentally dishonorable and cowardly. In his culture, true warriors faced their enemies with blade and fang, not with trickery and deception. He stood before the council and spoke of the battles he had witnessed, of the times when uncontrolled psychic power had led to disaster and death. He accused the Thousand Sons of arrogance and recklessness, of playing with forces that they could never truly understand or control. And he made it clear that if the council did not rein in these sorcerers, the Space Wolves would be happy to do it themselves. Other voices joined the chorus of condemnation. Rogel Dawn, ever cautious, expressed concerns about the unpredictability of psychic abilities on the battlefield. Corax of the Raven Guard, though more moderate in his views, admitted that he had grown uncomfortable working alongside the Thousand Sons. Even some of the librarians that Magnus had brought to testify on his behalf spoke against unrestricted use of psychic abilities, advocating for controls and limitations that Magnus found intolerable. The accusers presented their evidence with devastating effectiveness. They showed recordings of psychic catastrophes, worlds reduced to wastelands by uncontrolled warp energies. They called witnesses who had survived demonic incursions summoned by reckless sorcerers. They read from ancient texts that warned of the dangers of trafficking with the powers of the warp. Hour after hour, day after day, the prosecution built its case against the Thousand Sons, painting a picture of a legion that had strayed dangerously close to the very evil it claimed to be fighting. When Magnus finally rose to speak, he found himself facing an audience that had already largely made up its mind. He delivered his speech with all the eloquence he possessed, arguing that psychic power was a natural human ability that could not be suppressed, only controlled. He spoke of the knowledge that could be gained by exploring the warp, as of the defenses that could be raised against demonic incursion, of the bright future that awaited humanity if it could only overcome its fear of the unknown. His words were passionate and brilliant, and for a moment, it seemed that he might yet sway the council to his cause. But the Emperor had already made his decision. Perhaps he sensed the taint of chaos that clung to Magnus, despite the Crimson King's denials. Perhaps he feared that the growing use of psychic power across the legions would lead to catastrophe. Perhaps he was simply unwilling to risk the unity of his Imperium over what he saw as a minor disagreement about methodology. Whatever his reasons, the Emperor pronounced his verdict with terrible finality. All use of sorcery was forbidden throughout the Imperium, and the librarious departments within the legions were to be disbanded. Psychers were to be strictly controlled and limited to essential functions like astropathic communication and navigation. And Magnus, the primarch, who had advocated most strongly for psychic freedom, was specifically warned that any further transgression would be met with the destruction of his legion. The pronouncement fell upon Magnus like a physical blow, shattering his confidence and filling him with a bitter mixture of anger and despair. He had devoted his entire existence to the pursuit of knowledge, to the mastery of psychic power, and now his own father had declared that this pursuit was a crime. He tried to speak, to protest, to demand an explanation, but the Emperor silenced him with a single, terrible glance. In that moment, Magnus understood that he was not a partner in his father's great work, as he had always believed, but merely a tool to be used and discarded as the Emperor saw fit. The realization filled him with a rage that would never fully dissipate, a sense of betrayal that would color every action he took from that day forward. Magnus returned to Prospero in a black mood, his confidence shattered and his faith in his father deeply shaken. He withdrew into his pyramid, spending long months in meditation and study, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how he might yet prove the value of his work. But even as he sulked, the universe moved on without him, and events were set in motion that would make the debate at Nikaea seem trivial in comparison. Warmaster Horus, the most favored of the Emperor's sons, and had been corrupted by the powers of chaos during a near-fatal injury on the moon of Davin. The dark gods had shown him visions of a future in which the Emperor was worshipped as a god while his sons were forgotten, in which the sacrifices of the Great Crusade were rewarded with betrayal and abandonment. These visions were lies, carefully crafted to exploit Horus's pride and insecurity, but the War Master believed them utterly. He began to plot rebellion against his father, gathering allies among his brother primarchs and preparing for a civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. Magnus was not among the conspirators, but his fate was nonetheless bound up with Horus's treachery. In his endless exploration of the warp, Magnus had developed the ability to perceive possible futures, but to see the currents of fate as they flowed toward various destinations. And in one terrible vision, he saw everything. He saw Horus standing before the Emperor's throne, his sword raised to strike the killing blow. He saw the Imperium tearing itself apart in civil war, brother fighting brother across 1,000,000 worlds. He saw the bright future that his father had promised reduced to ash and blood and endless darkness.
And this is why Magnus is my favorite Primarch to talk about. Not because he's the most powerful, though he absolutely is in terms of raw psychic might. But because his story is the most human despite him being anything but, he just wanted to learn. He wanted to save his sons from the flesh change, he wanted to warn his father, and every single time his best intentions paved the road to damnation. I think we've all had moments where we were so sure we were doing the right thing, only to watch it blow up in our faces. Magnus just experienced that on a galactic scale. It doesn't excuse what he became, but it makes you understand how he got there, and that understanding is what separates good tragedy from cheap drama. But anyway, let's continue.
And he knew that he had to warn the Emperor, regardless of the prohibitions that had been placed upon him. This was the moment that would define Magnus's entire existence, the choice that would damn him forever in the eyes of history. He could have sent a message through conventional means, using astropathic relay or courier ships to warn Terra of Horus's betrayal. It would have taken longer, but the message would have arrived eventually, and Magnus would have remained within the bounds of the Emperor's decree. Instead, driven by pride and desperation, Magnus chose to use the one method that was guaranteed to reach his father in time. He would project his consciousness directly through the warp, appearing before the Emperor in person to deliver his warning. To accomplish this feat, Magnus required power beyond even his considerable abilities. He gathered his greatest sorcerers and conducted a massive ritual, drawing on psychic energies that caused tremors to shake the foundations of Prospero. His astral form blazed through the Imperium like a comet, tearing through the fabric of the warp with reckless abandon. But as he approached Terra, he encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated. A vast wall of psychic energy surrounded the Imperial Palace, a barrier that blocked all warp travel and protected Terra from demonic incursion. This was the Emperor's Webway project, a centuries-long effort to create a network of passages through the warp that would allow humanity to travel without risking exposure to chaos. It was to be the Emperor's greatest gift to his species, a means of finally freeing humanity from its dangerous dependency on the Imperium. Magnus did not know any of this. He saw only a barrier between himself and his father, an obstacle that had to be overcome if the Imperium was to be saved. And in his desperation, he turned to the one source of power that had always been there for him, the entity that had guided him since his youth, the being that even now whispered in his ear, offering assistance. And with power borrowed from Tzeentch, Magnus tore through the barrier, shattering the carefully maintained defenses and bursting through into the Emperor's sanctum. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The breach in the psychic barrier created a permanent wound in the fabric of reality, a doorway through which the denizens of the warp could pour into the heart of the Imperium. Demons flooded into the Webway project, slaughtering the workers and destroying centuries of irreplaceable work. The Emperor himself was forced to abandon all other concerns and take up position on the Golden Throne, using his own vast psychic power to hold the breach closed and prevent Terra itself from being overwhelmed. The great work was ruined, humanity's best hope for escaping the tyranny of the warp destroyed in a single catastrophic instant. And the being responsible, the son who had caused this unimaginable disaster, stood before his father with the news of Horus's betrayal. The Emperor did not listen. He could not listen, consumed as he was with the effort of holding shut the wound that Magnus had torn in reality. Even if he had been able to spare the attention, it is doubtful that he would have believed Magnus's warning. From his perspective, Magnus was the traitor, the son who had violated his explicit commands and destroyed his greatest work. The news about Horus was just another deception, a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The Emperor banished Magnus from his presence with a psychic scream of pure rage, casting the Crimson King back to Prospero in disgrace. Magnus emerged from the experience broken and confused, knowing that he had failed, but not entirely understanding how. He had tried to save the Imperium, and somehow he had made everything worse. The full scope of his transgression would not become clear to him until later, when he learned the truth about the Emperor's Webway project and understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed. But by then, it was already too late. Events had been set in motion that no power in the galaxy could reverse. The Emperor, believing Magnus to be in league with Horus, ordered his arrest. He dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero, commanding them to bring Magnus back to Terra to face justice. But Horus, who had learned of the Emperor's orders through his network of traitor sympathizers, saw an opportunity. He contacted Russ during the voyage to Prospero and delivered a false message, as claiming to speak with the Emperor's authority. The new orders were explicit and terrible. Magnus and the Thousand Sons were not to be arrested. They were to be destroyed, their homeworld burned, their population exterminated, their very name erased from history. Russ, who had always hated Magnus and his sorcerers, accepted the new orders without question. Perhaps he was secretly pleased at the opportunity to finally destroy his hated rival. Perhaps he genuinely believed that the Emperor had reconsidered his original judgment and decided on a harsher punishment. Perhaps he was simply following orders, as a good soldier should. Whatever his reasons, the Wolf King altered his course and began preparations for a full-scale planetary assault. Magnus knew they were coming. He had seen their approach in his visions and watched the Space Wolves' fleet drawing ever closer to Prospero. He could have prepared a defense, could have rallied his legion and the people of Prospero to resist the coming onslaught. With his psychic abilities and the power of his sorcerers, he might even have been able to repel the attack entirely. But Magnus did not prepare. He did not rally his forces or organize resistance. Instead, he withdrew into his pyramid and brooded, consumed by guilt and despair. In his darkest moments, Magnus had come to believe that he deserved what was coming. He had violated the Emperor's decree. He had destroyed the Webway project. He had brought ruin upon the Imperium through his arrogance and pride. Perhaps it was only just that he and his legion should pay the price for his failures. And he shrouded Prospero in a psychic barrier that blocked all communication, preventing his sons from learning of the approaching threat. He sent the Thousand Sons' fleet away on a false mission, leaving the planet virtually defenseless. He even blocked the visions of his own sorcerers, blinding them to the fate that awaited them. Magnus the Red had decided to accept his punishment, and he would allow nothing to interfere with his penance. When the Space Wolves arrived in the skies above Prospero, they found a world utterly unprepared for their assault. The orbital defenses were unmanned, the warning systems deactivated, the military installations empty of defenders. Leman Russ, perhaps troubled by the unexpected lack of resistance, attempted to contact Magnus directly, sending multiple messages through Vox channels demanding his surrender. Magnus refused to respond. He sat in his pyramid and listened to the crackling of the communication attempts, and he said nothing. Some accounts suggest that Russ spent nearly an hour attempting to establish communication, genuinely confused by the complete lack of response from a legion that should have been perfectly capable of detecting his fleet. The Wolf King had expected resistance, had prepared himself for a brutal fight against sorcerers who would use every dirty trick at their disposal to defend their homeworld. Instead, he found silence and emptiness, a world that seemed to have simply given up before the battle even began. It did not sit right with him, this passivity from an enemy he had always respected, even if he had never liked them. But Russ was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. Yes, he had been told to destroy the Thousand Sons, and that is what he would do, regardless of how strange their behavior might be. He gave the command, and the bombardment began. The first shells fell at dawn, streaking down from the heavens like meteors of destruction. The Space Wolves' fleet had taken up positions in close orbit, their weapons batteries trained on the gleaming spires of Tizca. When they opened fire, the result was apocalyptic. Energy beams carved through the crystalline architecture like knives through paper. Mass drivers slammed into the Great Pyramids, cracking their surfaces and sending cascades of debris raining down on the streets below. Within minutes, the city of light that Magnus had spent decades building began to burn. Thousands of civilians died in the first minutes, incinerated by orbital strikes or crushed beneath falling debris. The people of Prospero had trusted in Magnus to protect them, had believed that their primarch would never allow harm to come to the world he loved. Many of them died still believing that this must be some kind of test, some elaborate demonstration that would end with Magnus revealing the truth and putting everything right. They died with prayers on their lips, calling out to a god who had chosen not to answer. The 1,000 Sons, bewildered and unprepared, scrambled to organize some form of defense. Warriors who had been engaged in scholarly pursuits moments before now rushed to find their weapons and armor, trying to comprehend how they had come under attack without any warning. Communication between units was chaotic, and with conflicting reports and contradictory orders adding to the confusion. Many brothers died before they even reached their battle stations, caught in the open by the orbital bombardment that continued to rain down upon the city. Rubric of Ahriman, the Legion's chief librarian and Magnus's most trusted lieutenant, took command in his primarch's absence. He was one of the few 1,000 Sons who had sensed something wrong in the days leading up to the attack, who had tried to warn Magnus that danger was approaching. His concerns had been dismissed, his warnings ignored, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a disaster that he had seen coming but been unable to prevent. With typical efficiency, Ahriman began organizing the surviving defenders, rallying his brothers and the remnants of the Prospero militia into a defensive formation that might at least slow the attackers down. The Space Wolves descended upon Tizca like a grey tide, their drop pods and assault craft screaming down through the smoke-filled skies. They landed in the outskirts of the city, their warriors pouring out of their transports with weapons ready, the taste of battle already hot in their blood. The Vulca Fenrica, as they called themselves in their own tongue, were born for moments like this. They were the Emperor's executioners, the wolves he unleashed when he wanted something destroyed completely and forever. And now they had been unleashed upon the 1,000 Sons. The street-to-street fighting that followed was some of the most brutal in the history of the Great Crusade. The Space Wolves were ferocious warriors, their genetic heritage and cultural conditioning combining to create warriors who knew no fear and gave no quarter. They charged into the 1,000 Sons' positions with chainswords howling and bolters blazing, their war howls echoing through the burning streets like the calls of predators closing in on wounded prey. The Fenrisian wolves that accompanied them, massive beasts bred for war, on a world where everything was a predator, added their own savage fury to the assault. But the 1,000 Sons were no easy prey. Though caught off guard and outnumbered, they were still Space Marines, still the Emperor's finest warriors regardless of the circumstances of their creation. And they had weapons that the Space Wolves could not match. Sorcery, the very thing that had brought them to this moment, and now became their salvation. The prohibition of Nikaea was forgotten in the desperation of survival as 1,000 Sons librarians unleashed powers that had been forbidden for years. Bolts of psychic lightning tore through Space Wolves' formations. Walls of telekinetic force held back charging assault squads. Illusions and mental attacks sowed confusion and fear among warriors who had been trained to know no fear. The battle hung in the balance for hours, the two legions tearing at each other with a ferocity that left the streets of Tizca carpeted with the dead. But the Space Wolves had brought allies that the 1,000 Sons could not counter so easily. The Sisters of Silence, those blank-souled women whose very presence nullified psychic power, advanced alongside the Space Wolves, creating zones where Magnus's sorcerers found their powers suddenly useless. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's own personal warriors, fought with a precision and lethality that exceeded even the Space Marines. And the sheer weight of numbers began to tell as more and more Space Wolves poured down from orbit to join the assault. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Great Crusade, a nightmare of fire and slaughter that would haunt both legions for the rest of their existence. The Space Wolves descended upon Tizca with the ferocity for which they were famous, their chainswords and frost axes carving through 1,000 Sons and civilians alike. The 1,000 Sons fought back with sorcery and bolter fire, invoking powers that had been forbidden by the Council of Nikaea, using every weapon at their disposal to defend their homeworld. The streets of Tizca ran red with blood as brother killed brother, as the Emperor's greatest warriors tore each other apart over a misunderstanding that neither side fully comprehended. Magnus watched it all from his pyramid. He felt every death as a wound in his own soul. sensing the psychic screams of his sons as they were cut down by the space wolves. He felt the despair of the civilians who had trusted him to protect them, the terror of the children who died wondering why their gods had abandoned them. And still he did not act. He sat on his throne, and he suffered, accepting the punishment he believed he deserved, offering up his legion and his world as a sacrifice for his sins. But even Magnus could not maintain his passivity indefinitely. As the space wolves closed in on his pyramid, as his sons fell one by one in a desperate defense of their primarch, something within Magnus finally snapped. Perhaps it was the sight of Ahriman leading a hopeless charge against overwhelming odds. Perhaps it was the screams of the dying echoing through the streets of his beloved city. Perhaps it was simply the realization that his acceptance of punishment was itself a form of pride, a belief that his suffering could somehow atone for the magnitude of his failures. Whatever the cause, Magnus finally rose from his throne and descended from his pyramid to join the battle. The appearance of the Crimson King transformed the conflict entirely. Magnus strode through the burning streets of Tizca like an avatar of wrath, his psychic powers blazing around him like a corona of crimson flame. As space wolves, who looked upon him, died instantly, their minds destroyed by the sheer magnitude of his presence. Tanks and vehicles crumpled like paper before his gestures. Buildings exploded outward as he passed, reduced to rubble by the force of his rage. For a few glorious hours, it seemed that the Thousand Suns might actually prevail, that Magnus's power might be enough to drive back the wolves from his homeworld. But Leman Russ was coming, and he was bringing warriors specifically equipped to combat psychers. The Sisters of Silence, those blank-souled women who nullified psychic power through their mere presence, advanced alongside the space wolves, creating zones where Magnus's sorcery simply ceased to function. The Thousand Suns who relied on their mental powers found themselves suddenly helpless, as cut down by bolt and blade before they could adapt. The tide of battle turned once more, and the Thousand Suns began to fall back toward their Primarch's pyramid. The climax of the battle came when Magnus and Russ finally faced each other in single combat, two demigods clashing amid the ruins of a dying world. It was a confrontation that had been building for decades, fueled by the mutual hatred and misunderstanding that had poisoned their relationship since Nikaea. Russ fought with the savage fury of his legion, his weapons carving great wounds in Magnus's flesh. Magnus responded with psychic attacks of devastating power, searing away Russ's armor and scorching his very soul. The two brothers battled for what seemed like hours, their struggle laying waste to everything around them. In the end, Magnus was broken, while Russ's superior combat skills combined with the weakening effect of the nearby Sisters of Silence proved too much for even the Crimson King to overcome. Russ blinded Magnus, driving a blade into his remaining eye, then lifted him above his head and broke his back across his knee. The sound of Magnus's spine snapping echoed across the battlefield, stunning both legions into momentary silence. Russ raised his weapon for the killing blow, ready to end the life of his hated brother once and for all. But Magnus was not ready to die. In that moment of extremity, with his body broken and his world burning around him, Magnus made the choice that would define the rest of his existence. He reached out to the entity that had always been there for him, the power that had guided him since childhood, and he accepted what it had always been offering. In exchange for his soul, Tzeentch granted Magnus the power to escape his death, to transport himself and his surviving sons to safety. With the last of his strength, Magnus completed the spell that Ahriman had been preparing, and in a blinding flash of light, the Thousand Suns vanished from Prospero, leaving nothing behind but ash and memory. They reappeared on a world that had been prepared for them in the depths of the Eye of Terror, a realm of pure chaos, where the laws of reality held no dominion. The planet of the sorcerers, as it would come to be known, was a gift from Tzeentch to his new servant, a place where Magnus could recover from his wounds and plan his revenge against those who had betrayed him. But the price of salvation was steep indeed. Magnus was no longer merely a servant of the Emperor, a loyal son who had fallen from grace through well-intentioned mistakes. He was now bound to the God of Change, his soul pledged in eternal service to the architect of fate. The 1,000 Sons had become a traitor legion, enemies of the Imperium they had once served. Magnus did not immediately embrace his new allegiance. For years, he remained aloof from the other traitors, refusing to participate in Horus's rebellion, despite his anger at the Emperor. He blamed the War Master for the destruction of Prospero, correctly suspecting that Horus had altered the Emperor's orders to Leman Russ. He blamed the Emperor for his harsh judgment and his refusal to listen to warnings about Horus's betrayal. He blamed himself for the arrogance and pride that had led to such catastrophic consequences. Consumed by his own bitterness, Magnus retreated into his tower on the planet of the sorcerers, spending years in brooding isolation while the Horus heresy raged across the galaxy. But Tzeentch had not saved Magnus merely to let him sulk. The god of change had plans for his new servant, schemes within schemes that would take millennia to fully unfold. Through manipulation and circumstance, Tzeentch gradually drew Magnus back into the conflict, using his guilt and his rage as levers to move him toward ever greater acts of destruction. Magnus's sons needed him, the god whispered. The Emperor had to pay for what he had done. Only by embracing his full power could Magnus hope to achieve the vengeance he craved. Eventually, Magnus relented. He descended from his tower and joined the traitor forces at the Siege of Terra, the climactic battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. His reasons were complex, a mixture of rage, desperation, and a twisted sense of loyalty to his fallen sons. He told himself that he was fighting for vengeance, for justice, for the memory of Prospero. But in truth, he was simply doing what Tzeentch had always intended, playing his part in the God of Change's eternal game. During the Siege of Terra, Magnus focused his considerable power on a single, terrible goal. He assaulted the Emperor's psychic defenses from within the warp, seeking to breach the wards that protected the Imperial Palace and allow demons to manifest within Terra's most sacred precincts. It was during this campaign that Magnus came face to face with Vulcan, the primarch of the Salamanders, and one of the few loyalists still capable of opposing him. As the two brothers battled within the webway itself, their clash spanning realms of reality and unreality. Vulcan was a perpetual, one of those rare beings who could not truly die, and Magnus killed him again and again, only to watch him regenerate and resume the fight. But even a perpetual could be destroyed, and Magnus was on the verge of unmaking Vulcan completely when the Salamander's primarch delivered a final desperate blow. His hammer struck Magnus's head, shattering the Crimson King's physical form and banishing him back to the warp. The battle was over, and Magnus had lost yet again. The Horus heresy ended shortly thereafter, with Horus slain by the Emperor and the traitor forces scattered into the Eye of Terror. Magnus retreated to the planet of the sorcerers, nursing his wounds and contemplating his failures. He had become everything he had once fought against, a servant of chaos, an enemy of humanity, a monster that even his own sons regarded with fear and reverence rather than love. The dreams he had once cherished, of a future in which psychic power was humanity's greatest tool, had been reduced to ash alongside Prospero. All that remained was an eternity of service to a god who cared nothing for him, and a burning hatred for the brother who had broken his back and the father who had broken his heart. But the tragedy of Magnus was not yet complete. The worst was yet to come, not from external enemies or divine punishment, but from the very legion he had sacrificed so much to protect. The flesh change, that terrible genetic curse that Magnus had bargained away his eye to suppress, began to return with a vengeance. Freed from the disciplines that had held it in check, empowered by the raw chaos energies of the Eye of Terror, the mutation swept through the 1,000 Sons like a plague. Battle brothers who had survived the horrors of Prospero and the Siege of Terra found themselves transformed into mindless spawn, their bodies twisted beyond recognition, their minds shattered by the agony of metamorphosis. The flesh change in its renewed form was even more terrible than it had been in the early days of the Legion. The raw chaos energy that permeated the Eye of Terror accelerated the process, turning what had once been a gradual degeneration into a rapid and catastrophic transformation. Warriors who went to sleep human would awaken as monsters, their bodies bloated with tumorous growths and extra limbs. Some transformed in the middle of conversations, in their flesh rippling and reforming, even as they tried to speak. Others held on for days or weeks, watching in horror as their bodies slowly betrayed them, knowing that there was nothing they could do to stop the inevitable. Magnus watched his sons suffer and felt every transformation as a wound in his own soul. He had sacrificed his eye, his honor, his very humanity to save them from this fate, and now it had returned anyway. Everything he had done, every bargain he had made, every price he had paid, had been for nothing. The god of change had played him for a fool, offering a cure that was merely a postponement, a stay of execution rather than a pardon. And now that the execution had come due, Magnus found himself powerless to prevent it. He tried everything within his considerable power to halt the progression of the curse, and he performed rituals of binding and transformation, attempted to create new versions of the cure he had received so long ago, bargained with every entity in the warp that would listen to him. Nothing worked. The flesh change was Tzeentch's gift, and Tzeentch had decided that it was time for that gift to be fully expressed. No power Magnus possessed could stand against the will of the god of change. Ahriman watched his brothers fall one by one, and he refused to accept their fate. The chief librarian had always been the most brilliant of Magnus's sons, a sorcerer whose power was exceeded only by the primarch himself. He had survived Prospero, survived the Siege of Terror, survived the long years of exile on the planet of the sorcerers, and now he watched as the legion he loved was slowly destroyed by a curse that seemed to have no remedy. Against Magnus's explicit orders, Ahriman gathered a cabal of the legion's most powerful sorcerers and began to research alternatives. They pored over the Book of Magnus, that vast tome of forbidden lore that contained the secrets of their primarch. They conducted experiments on brothers who were already too far gone to save, trying to understand the mechanism of the curse. They reached out to entities in the warp, seeking knowledge that might point the way to salvation. What they found was a spell of unprecedented magnitude, a ritual that would require the combined power of every sorcerer in the cabal, but that promised to halt the flesh change forever. Ahriman presented his findings to Magnus, begging for permission to attempt the ritual. Magnus refused, warning that such power could not be controlled, that the risks were too great. But Ahriman was past listening. He had watched too many brothers die, had felt the curse beginning to manifest in his own flesh. Better to die trying to save the Legion than to watch it slowly dissolve into a horde of mindless monsters. The ritual was conducted in secret, without Magnus's knowledge or approval. Ahriman and his cabal gathered in a hidden chamber deep beneath the surface of the planet of the sorcerers. Their psychic power combined into a single devastating spell. Drawing upon knowledge gleaned from the Book of Magnus, a tome of forbidden lore that contained the secrets of their primarch, Ahriman and his cabal began to cast what would come to be known as the Rubric of Ahriman. The spell worked, after a fashion. The flesh change was stopped, arrested in its tracks by the overwhelming power of the ritual. But the cost was beyond anything Ahriman had imagined. Every Thousand Sons battle brother who lacked sufficient psychic power to resist the spell was transformed, not into spawn, but into something perhaps even worse. Their bodies crumbled to dust within their armor, their souls bound forever to the ceramite shells that had once protected their flesh. They became rubric marines, automaton warriors who could march and fight, but could no longer think, speak, or feel. The proud legion that had once numbered in the thousands was reduced to a handful of surviving sorcerers and an army of silent, dust-filled suits of armor. Magnus felt every transformation as if it were happening to his own body. He felt his sons die, one by one, their consciousnesses flickering out like candles in a hurricane, and he felt their souls crying out in confusion and terror as they were ripped from their flesh and bound to cold metal. When the spell finally ended and the magnitude of the disaster became clear, Magnus descended from his tower in a fury that shook the very foundations of the planet of the sorcerers. He confronted Ahriman among the silent ranks of Rubric Marines, and for a moment, it seemed that the chief librarian would die for his presumption. But Tzeentch intervened, speaking directly to Magnus for the first time since Prospero. The god of change pointed out that the rubric had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. The flesh change was ended. The Thousand Sons would never again fall to mutation. If the price was high, well, had Magnus not always believed that knowledge was worth any sacrifice? Tzeentch laughed, and in that laughter, Magnus finally understood the full depth of his damnation. He had been played from the beginning, manipulated every step of the way, his every choice guided by the invisible hand of the architect of fate. Even now, even knowing the truth, he could not break free. Tzeentch owned him, body and soul, and there was nothing he could do about it. Magnus banished Ahriman from the planet of the sorcerers, condemning him to wander the galaxy in search of a way to undo the rubric. It was not mercy, it was punishment, forcing the chief librarian to spend eternity confronting the consequences of his actions. Then Magnus ascended his tower once more and turned his gaze upon the Imperium, contemplating an eternity of vengeance against those who had wronged him. The dreams of the young primarch, who had sought to lead humanity into a golden age of psychic enlightenment, were gone forever. In their place was only bitterness, rage, and an endless hunger for destruction. 10,000 years have passed since the Horus heresy, and Magnus remains on his throne atop the highest tower of the planet of the sorcerers. He has become a demon primarch, his physical form a towering monstrosity of crimson flesh and burning warp fire. Great wings of iridescent feathers sprout from his back, and his single eye blazes with the accumulated knowledge of millennia. He is more powerful now than he ever was in life, his psychic abilities magnified 1,000-fold by his communion with Tzeentch. But he is also more diminished, his soul fragmented into countless shards scattered across the galaxy. Yet his identity, a patchwork of contradictions and conflicts that can never be fully resolved. Throughout the millennia, Magnus has emerged from his tower periodically to wreak havoc upon the Imperium. He has led his 1,000 sons against the Space Wolves on multiple occasions, seeking revenge for the destruction of Prospero. His hatred for the sons of Russ has never dimmed, never softened, never found any form of resolution. 10,000 years have passed since the burning of Prospero, and Magnus remembers every detail of that terrible day as if it happened yesterday. The image of his city in flames, the screams of his sons as they died, the feeling of his back breaking over Russ's knee. These memories are etched into his consciousness like scars that will never heal. The most famous of Magnus's vengeance campaigns was the Battle of the Fang, which took place in the 32nd millennium, roughly 1,000 years after the Horus heresy. At that time, the Space Wolves were led by Great Wolf Harek Ironhelm, a warrior who had developed an obsession with hunting down and destroying Magnus and the remnants of his legion. Magnus exploited this obsession ruthlessly, using it as a weapon against the very enemy who sought to destroy him. Through carefully crafted illusions and planted intelligence, Magnus convinced Ironhelm that the 1,000 Sons had established a major stronghold on the world of Gangava, deep within the Eye of Terror. The reports suggested that Magnus was gathering his forces for a massive assault, rebuilding his legion to strength that it had not possessed since before Prospero. At Ironhelm, consumed by his desire to finally destroy his ancient enemy, mobilized nearly the entire Space Wolves chapter for an immediate assault on Gangava. He left only a skeleton force behind to defend Fenris, believing that the 1,000 Sons were all gathered in one place, waiting to be destroyed. But Gangava was a trap. The forces Magnus had gathered there were real enough, but they were a distraction, a sacrificial pawn in a game that spanned star systems. As Ironhelm led his forces into the Eye of Terror, Magnus launched his true assault on Fenris itself. The 1,000 Sons fleet emerged from the warp above the Space Wolves' homeworld without warning, catching the minimal defenders completely by surprise. For 40 days and 40 nights, the Thousand Suns assaulted the Fang, or the massive fortress monastery that served as the Space Wolves' headquarters. Magnus himself led the assault, his psychic powers tearing through the citadel's defenses like paper. The Space Wolves fought with desperate fury, every warrior knowing that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the very existence of their chapter. The venerable Dreadnought. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, one of the only living warriors who had participated in the original burning of Prospero, was awakened from his millennia-long slumber to lead the defense. Magnus confronted Bjorn in the depths of the Fang, two ancient warriors meeting across a gulf of 10,000 years. Their battle was legendary, the demon primarch's sorcery clashing against the Dreadnought's fury. In the end, Bjorn managed to wound Magnus grievously, breaking the Crimson King's back for the second time in his existence. But it was not enough to destroy him. When Ironhelm finally realized the deception and rushed his forces back to Fenris, Magnus retreated into the warp, taking his surviving forces with him. The Thousand Suns had not conquered Fenris, but they had achieved Magnus's true goal. They had destroyed the gene seed vaults that would have allowed the Space Wolves to create successor chapters, ensuring that the Sons of Russ would forever be limited in their numbers. More recently, in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, Magnus launched his most ambitious assault yet on the Space Wolves' homeworld. The siege of the Fenris system was a campaign of unprecedented scope, involving not just the Thousand Suns, but demonic hordes summoned directly from the warp. As it began with Magnus manipulating events from behind the scenes, using the demon known as the Changeling to sow discord and confusion throughout the Imperium. The Changeling impersonated Imperial officials and Space Marine commanders, issuing false orders and spreading rumors about the Space Wolves' supposed corruption. By the time the Thousand Suns fleet appeared in the Fenris system, the Space Wolves had already been weakened by friendly fire from Imperial forces who believed them to be traitors. Magnus's true goal was not merely vengeance, though that certainly played a role in his planning. He sought to transport the planet of the sorcerers from the Eye of Terror into real space, anchoring it above the ruins of Prospero. This would give the Thousand Suns a permanent base of operations in the material universe, free from the constraints and dangers of the warp. It would also serve as a symbolic revenge, placing Magnus's new homeworld in the exact spot where his old homeworld had been destroyed. The ritual required to accomplish this feat was immense, requiring vast quantities of psychic energy and the sacrifice of entire worlds. Magnus provided both, orchestrating a series of devastating attacks across the Fenris system that killed billions and generated the psychic fuel his sorcerers needed. The death screams of the dying were channeled into the ritual, their souls serving as the currency by which Magnus purchased his homeworld's return to real space. The Space Wolves and their Imperial allies fought desperately to stop the ritual, while recognizing that success would give the Thousand Suns a permanent foothold from which to threaten the entire segmentum. Magnus himself descended to the surface of Fenris, leading his forces against the defenders of the Fang in person. The battle that followed was one of the largest engagements between Space Marine forces since the Horus Heresy, involving nearly every great company of the Space Wolves, as well as elements of the Grey Knights, the Dark Angels, and numerous other Imperial formations. Though Magnus was eventually defeated and banished by Logan Grimnar, wielding the artifact called the Axe of Morkai, he achieved his primary objective. The planet of the sorcerers now floats in the material universe, a beacon of chaos power that threatens the entire Imperium. The Great Tower of Magnus rises above its twisted surface, a monument to ambition and damnation, and from its heights, the Crimson King gazes out upon the galaxy he once helped to build, contemplating an eternity of war against the father who rejected him and the brothers who betrayed him. Magnus has also clashed with other Imperial forces, most notably Robuta Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who was resurrected from his long stasis in the early 42nd Millennium. The two brothers battled on Luna, the Emperor's own moon, in a confrontation that nearly cost Guilliman his life. Only the intervention of the Sisters of Silence, whose null abilities temporarily neutralized Magnus's psychic powers, allowed the Lord Commander of the Imperium to escape. The battle demonstrated that even after 10 millennia, Magnus remains one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, a threat to everything the Imperium holds dear. To understand Magnus's power is to understand why he is called the mightiest psyker in Warhammer 40,000, surpassed only by the Emperor himself. His abilities span every discipline of psychic warfare, from the brutal telekinesis that can tear starships apart to the subtle telepathy that can subvert entire planetary populations without a shot being fired. He can see the future with terrifying accuracy, perceive the currents of the warp with clarity that no other being can match, and manipulate reality itself through force of will alone. His gaze of Magnus can reduce entire armies to ash with a single glance, while his mastery of sorcery allows him to summon demonic entities, create pocket dimensions, and alter the flow of time within localized areas. The full extent of Magnus's psychic abilities defies easy categorization. The Imperium's classification system for psykers, which ranges from row-level negligibles to alpha-plus beings of devastating power, was never designed to measure beings like Magnus. He exists in a category of his own, a classification that the Inquisition simply calls beyond all measure. His raw psychic output, when fully unleashed, can be detected from systems away, a blazing beacon in the warp that draws the attention of demons and gods alike. In terms of specific abilities, Magnus has demonstrated mastery over virtually every psychic discipline known to humanity. Telepathy allows him to read minds, implant suggestions, and even completely dominate the wills of those weaker than himself. During the Great Crusade, there were worlds that submitted to compliance without a single shot being fired, their leaders simply waking up one morning with the unshakable conviction that joining the Imperium was the only sensible course of action. Magnus never admitted to having influenced their decisions, but those who knew him suspected the truth. Telekinesis gives Magnus the ability to manipulate physical matter through thought alone. At its most basic level, this allows him to deflect weapons fire and create shields of invisible force. At its most extreme, Magnus has demonstrated the ability to crush battle tanks like empty cans, to hurl enemies across vast distances, and even to hold back the collapse of buildings with nothing but the power of his mind. During the Siege of Terra, he used telekinesis to tear open the hulls of loyalist warships from the inside, killing their crews without ever setting foot aboard. Pyromancy, the manipulation of fire through psychic means, is another of Magnus's specialties. He can conjure flames from thin air, control existing fires with a gesture, and even transform his own body into living fire that burns everything it touches. The fires he creates are not ordinary flames, but manifestations of warp energy, burning with colors that have no name in human language, and consuming matter in ways that defy the laws of physics. During the Battle of the Fang, Magnus strode through the halls of the Space Wolves' fortress, wreathed in crimson flame, burning everything in his path to ash. Divination allows Magnus to perceive the future, and seeing the currents of possibility that flow through the warp. This is perhaps his most dangerous ability, for it means that he is rarely caught off guard by enemy movements. He can perceive threats before they materialize, anticipate attacks before they are launched, and plan counter-moves to strategies that have not yet been conceived. The only limitation on this ability is that the future is not fixed, that the currents of possibility shift constantly in response to the choices made by millions of beings across the galaxy. Even Magnus cannot see every possible future or predict every possible outcome. Biomancy gives Magnus the ability to manipulate living flesh, both his own and that of others. He can heal wounds that would be fatal to any other being, regenerating lost limbs and organs in a matter of moments. But he can alter his physical form at will, growing larger or smaller, stronger or faster, adapting his body to whatever challenges he faces. And he can use this power offensively as well, inducing cellular collapse in his enemies, causing their bodies to simply fall apart at a molecular level. Beyond these specific disciplines, Magnus possesses abilities that seem to be unique to him alone. He can open portals through reality, creating gateways that connect distant points in space or even in time. He can manipulate the fabric of the warp itself, reshaping the Imperium according to his will. He can bind and command demonic entities, forcing them to serve him through sheer psychic dominance. And his understanding of sorcery, the ritualized application of psychic power, is unmatched by any mortal being. As a demon primarch, Magnus's power is further augmented by his connection to Tzeentch. He can manifest virtually anywhere in the galaxy given sufficient preparation, drawing upon the warp to project his form across vast distances. He is functionally immortal, his physical body merely a shell for the daemonic essence that now constitutes his true being. Even if destroyed, he can reform in the warp and eventually return to plague the material universe. The only reliable counters to his power are the blank-souled nulls of the Sisters of Silence and the Culexus assassins, whose presence disrupts the psychic energies upon which Magnus depends. The relationship between Magnus and Tzeentch is complex and often contradictory, much like everything else associated with the god of change. On one level, Magnus is Tzeentch's greatest mortal servant, as a being of such psychic power that he serves as one of the primary conduits through which the Changer of Ways extends his influence into the material universe. When Tzeentch wishes something done in real space, it is often Magnus who carries out his will, leading armies of thousand suns and summon demons against the enemies of chaos. But Magnus is not a willing servant, not in the way that some of the other demon primarchs have embraced their patron gods. Mortarion has accepted his role as Nurgle's champion, finding a twisted kind of peace in the embrace of decay. Fulgrim revels in his service to Slaanesh, pursuing ever greater sensations and excesses. Even Angron, whose demonic ascension was forced upon him against his will, has come to embody Horn's ideals of endless slaughter. Magnus, by contrast, has never stopped resenting his bondage to Tzeentch. He knows that he was manipulated from the beginning, that every choice he made was part of the God of Change's scheme. This knowledge burns within him like a fire that can never be extinguished. Tzeentch, for his part, seems to find Magnus's resentment amusing rather than threatening. The God of Change is patient beyond mortal comprehension, playing games that span millennia and involve countless moving pieces. Magnus is one of those pieces, valuable but not irreplaceable, powerful but ultimately controllable. Whenever Magnus threatens to slip the leash, Tzeentch simply reminds him of the price of disobedience. The rubric can be undone, the god whispers. The dust-filled automatons that make up the bulk of the thousand suns can be dispersed into the warp, yet their bound souls scattered beyond all hope of recovery. And Magnus himself can be unmade, his existence erased as easily as one might erase a chalk drawing from a board. So Magnus continues to serve, not out of loyalty or devotion, but out of fear and necessity. He hates Tzeentch with a passion that rivals his hatred for the Emperor and the Space Wolves. But hatred changes nothing. The chains that bind him are forged of his own choices, his own mistakes, his own pride. They cannot be broken by rage or resentment, only endured. The nature of Magnus's demonic existence also means that he is no longer entirely the being he once was. When he made his final bargain with Tzeentch during the Siege of Terra, his soul was shattered into countless fragments that scattered across the galaxy. These shards, as they came to be known, each embodied a different aspect of Magnus's personality, a different facet of his complex nature. Some represented his ambition, others his guilt, still others his rage or his sorrow, or his desperate desire for redemption. Over the millennia, Magnus has worked to recover these fragments, absorbing them back into himself to become more complete. Ahriman has aided in this effort, tracking down shards across the galaxy and reuniting them with their original owner. But not all the shards have been recovered, and some that have been absorbed have changed Magnus in ways that even he does not fully understand. The being who exists today is not quite the same as the Magnus who fell at Prospero. not quite the same as the Magnus who participated in the Siege of Terror. He is a patchwork of recovered memories and reabsorbed essences. He is a composite entity whose true nature is difficult even for him to grasp. Most significantly, some of the shards representing Magnus's most noble qualities, his compassion, his love for humanity, his desire to serve a cause greater than himself, were lost forever during the failed second rubric. These fragments were either destroyed outright or scattered so completely that they can never be recovered. This means that the Magnus who exists today is fundamentally darker than the Magnus who once existed. His capacity for empathy and self-sacrifice diminished, his tendency toward rage and destruction enhanced. The tragic hero who fell to chaos through good intentions has become something closer to a true villain, a being whose remaining humanity is buried so deep that it rarely influences his actions. But perhaps Magnus's most terrifying ability is his mind itself, that vast intellect that has been accumulating knowledge for more than 10,000 years. He knows secrets that could unmake worlds, possesses understanding of the warp that surpasses even most chaos gods in certain narrow areas, and has spent millennia studying the weaknesses of the Imperium. Every scheme he hatches, every plan he puts into motion, is the product of a mind that has had centuries to consider every possibility and prepare for every contingency. Facing Magnus is not merely facing a warrior or a sorcerer. It is facing an intelligence that has been plotting against humanity since before the Imperium was born. And yet, for all his power, Magnus remains a tragic figure. He never wanted to become what he is, and never sought to serve the dark gods or destroy the civilization he once helped to build. Every step of his fall was taken with the best of intentions. Every disaster he caused the result of trying to do what he believed was right. He was a scholar who became a warrior, a loyalist who became a traitor, a son who became his father's greatest enemy. His story is a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the mightiest can fall, and that the road to damnation is often paved with the most noble of aspirations. There are those who say that Magnus did nothing wrong, that he was a victim of circumstance and misunderstanding, that his fall was engineered by forces beyond his control. There is some truth to this perspective. Magnus was manipulated by Tzeentch from the moment of his birth. Every choice he made guided toward the outcome the god of change desired. The emperor's harsh judgment at Nikaea, Russ's hatred, Horus's treachery, all of these factors combined to push Magnus toward damnation, often against his own will. But there is also truth in the opposing view, that Magnus's arrogance and pride were the primary causes of his downfall. He was warned repeatedly about the dangers of the warp by his father, by his brothers, by his own experiences. He chose to ignore those warnings, convinced that his superior intellect and power made him immune to the perils that had destroyed lesser beings. When he broke through the Emperor's webway, he knew he was violating his father's explicit commands. He did it anyway, believing that he knew better, that his judgment was superior to the Emperor's. The catastrophe that followed was a direct result of this pride, a disaster that Magnus himself caused through his refusal to acknowledge his own limitations. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Magnus was both victim and perpetrator, manipulated and manipulator, innocent and guilty. His story defies simple categorization, refusing to fit neatly into the boxes of hero or villain. He is, perhaps, the most human of the primarchs, not despite his tremendous power, but because of it. His flaws, his failures, and his ultimate damnation all stem from qualities that are recognizably, painfully human: pride, ambition, the desire to be recognized and appreciated, the desperate need to protect those he loved. These are the weaknesses that Chaos exploited, the vulnerabilities through which Tzeentch worked his corruption. In the end, while Magnus the Red stands as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the perils of believing oneself immune to the laws that bind lesser beings. He was given everything: power beyond imagining, intellect that dwarfed the greatest minds of his age. the love of a father who was literally the most powerful being in the galaxy. And he threw it all away, not through malice or greed, but through the simple inability to recognize his own limitations. He thought he could control the warp. He thought he could outsmart the Chaos Gods. He thought he knew better than everyone else. He was wrong. And now he spends eternity on a throne of sorcery, plotting schemes that serve no purpose beyond his own revenge, leading armies of dust-filled automatons against enemies he once called brothers. The libraries of Prospero are ashes, but the dreams of enlightenment are forgotten. The father who might have forgiven him sits on a throne of his own, sustained only by the sacrifice of thousands of psykers each day, holding shut the very breach that Magnus tore in reality 10 millennia ago. This is the legacy of Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the most powerful psyker in Warhammer 40,000. Power without wisdom, knowledge without understanding, ambition without humility. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, he stands as a monument to the terrible price of pride, and a reminder that even the mightiest can fall when they forget the limits of their own mortality. His story resonates across the millennia because it touches upon something fundamentally human. We all know what it is like to believe ourselves smarter than we are. He has to dismiss the warnings of those who care about us, to pursue our goals with such single-minded determination that we become blind to the damage we cause along the way. Magnus was not an evil being, not in the beginning. He was brilliant and ambitious and desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's love. These are not villainous traits. They are human traits, magnified to superhuman proportions by the nature of his creation. And that is perhaps the most tragic aspect of his fall. Magnus was designed to be humanity's savior, the being who would lead our species into a golden age of psychic enlightenment. Instead, he became one of our greatest enemies, a demon primarch whose very existence threatens the survival of the Imperium. The dreams he once cherished, of a future in which knowledge triumphed over ignorance and understanding conquered fear, have been twisted into nightmares of sorcery and corruption. The being who wanted nothing more than his father's approval now plots that father's destruction with every breath he takes. Some say that Magnus's fate was sealed from the moment of his creation, that the Chaos Gods had marked him as their own before he ever drew breath. There may be truth to this. Tzeentch was watching Magnus from the beginning, guiding his steps down a path that led inexorably to damnation. Every choice Magnus made, every bargain he struck, every mistake he committed was part of the God of Change's eternal scheme. In this view, Magnus was never anything more than a puppet, dancing on strings he could not see, believing himself free when he was always a prisoner. But others argue that Magnus had the power to choose differently, that at every crucial juncture he could have stepped off the path that Tzeentch had laid for him. He could have heeded the Emperor's warnings about the warp. He could have accepted the verdict at Nikaea and found other ways to pursue his goals. He could have sent his message to Terra through conventional means rather than tearing a hole in reality. He could have fought at Prospero rather than accepting his punishment. Every step of his fall involved a choice, and every choice moved him closer to the damnation he ultimately embraced. The truth, as is so often the case in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Magnus was manipulated, yes, but he was not mindless. He had agency, even if the options available to him were constrained by forces beyond his comprehension. His tragedy is not that he was forced to become a monster, but that he chose to become one, step by step, decision by decision, always believing that he was doing the right thing. In this, Magnus serves as a warning to all of us who would reach for power beyond our grasp. The warp is patient, and it rewards ambition with corruption. The gods of chaos do not need to force anyone to serve them. They simply create circumstances in which serving them seems like the only sensible choice. They offer power to the powerless, knowledge to the curious, change to the desperate. And by the time their victims realize the true cost of these gifts, it is already too late. Magnus the Red is the most powerful psyker in Warhammer 40,000. But his power has brought him nothing but suffering. He has spent 10,000 years in service to a god who cares nothing for him, leading an army of dust-filled automatons against enemies he once called brothers. The libraries of Prospero are ashes. The dreams of enlightenment are forgotten. The father who might have forgiven him sits on a throne of his own, sustained only by the sacrifice of thousands of psykers each day, holding shut the very breach that Magnus tore in reality 10 millennia ago. Is this power? Is this the reward for being the greatest sorcerer humanity has ever produced? Magnus would laugh at such a question if he still had the capacity for laughter. He would tell you that power is meaningless without purpose, that knowledge is worthless without wisdom, and that all the psychic ability in the galaxy cannot fill the void left by betrayed love and broken faith. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Magnus's story. Power alone is not enough. Intelligence alone is not enough. Even the best intentions are not enough if they are not tempered by humility, guided by wisdom, and grounded in a clear understanding of one's own limitations. Magnus had everything, and he lost it all, not because he was weak, but because he was strong in all the wrong ways. For those of you who have walked with me through this journey into the tragic life of Magnus the Red, I thank you for your time and your attention. His story is one of the most compelling in all of Warhammer 40,000, a narrative of potential squandered and good intentions perverted, of a son who only ever wanted his father's love and a father who could never give it. Whether you see Magnus as a victim or a villain, there is no denying the power of his tale, the way it speaks to something deep within the human experience. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is filled with stories like this. Tales of heroes who became villains, and villains who believed themselves heroes. It is a setting that does not offer easy answers or comfortable moralities, a galaxy in which the line between good and evil is often blurred beyond recognition. Magnus's story embodies this ambiguity perfectly, challenging us to question our assumptions about heroism and villainy, about fate and free will, about the nature of power and the price of ambition. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Crimson King's history, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless other stories in the grim darkness of the far future waiting to be told. Tales of heroes and villains, of triumphs and tragedies, of beings whose lives shape the destiny of a galaxy. Together, we can explore them all, one video at a time. Let me know in the comments which characters or events you would like to learn about next. Your suggestions help shape the content of this channel, and I am always eager to hear what aspects of this vast and complex universe interest you the most. Until then, may the Emperor protect you. Or, if you serve other masters, may your scheming bring you closer to your goals. In the grim darkness of the far future, we all need something to believe in, and some light to guide us through the darkness that threatens to consume everything we hold dear. For Magnus, that light was knowledge, and in pursuing it, he lost himself. May your own pursuits lead you to better ends. This is Q on 40,000 signing off. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.